is the 14th of September 2020. I am reading Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth, written by Stuart Holroyd. It was published in 1977. And in fact, chapter 8 was really the ending of the journey, which took place in the Middle East in the early 70s to prevent a nuclear war strike. It was very fascinating. And this is chapter 9, and it seems to be ending words. I haven't really read it, so I will share it with you now. Page 302, Anatomy of a Mystery. To conclude, I propose to discuss a few key questions and make a few observations of the material presented in this book. Let us begin with what is probably the most crucial question of all. Who or what is Tom? As I see it, there are 5 possibilities to be taken into consideration. Number 1, Tom is a pure invention, a creation of Andrija, Phyllis, or John, or all of the 3 of them in collusion. 2, Tom is an unconscious invention, a composite created out of an information contained in the minds of the sitters by the well-known mediumistic process of withdrawal of such information. 3, Tom is a secondary personality of Phyllis's, endowed with PSI abilities that takes over when she is in a disassociated state of consciousness. 4, Tom is a spirit, a discarnate entity with extraordinary powers of invention and cognition. 5, Tom is what he says he is, an intelligent being from another part of the cosmos. The possibility of fraud and invention can, I think, be quite definitely ruled out on the basis of what we now know of the personalities of John, Andrija and Phyllis, the manner of their coming together and their sustained commitment and dedication. Some hyper-skeptical readers may not agree, and some, it occurs to me, may even suspect that I have made the whole thing up. But I think that the majority will agree with me that the possibility number 1 can be eliminated. So we are left with 2 parapsychological hypotheses, possibilities 2 and 3, and 2 hypotheses that we may call transcendental, possibilities 4 and 5. All 4 of which come down to the basic question whether Tom exists independently of the 3 and their shared situation. Let us see what relevant evidence we can marshal from the communications that might throw some light on this question. In view of the complexity of the material and of the problem it poses, the most convenient approach will be to break down and analyze the evidence under a number of subheadings. Alleged identities and abilities is the first heading. Tom states repeatedly in the communications that he represents as spokesman, and is one of the 9 governing principles and powers of the universe. But he insists we are not God. All of you and all of us make God. He's always insistent that man's tendency to worship and deify what he does not understand only inhibits his own and the planet's development. We are not your gods, he says. We do not rule you or control you. We are all one, and we work in harmony with you. Men have conceived God as being omnipotent and omniscient, and according to Tom, this erroneous belief has made the work of the 9 very difficult. Far from being omniscient, they are puzzled by the ways of the world and of men. It is important for us to learn through you of the nature of the physical world, says Tom. And again, we cannot do for this planet what this planet must do for itself. But what the planet must do for itself. But if the abilities of the 9 and their associated civilizations are limited, they are certainly impressive by human standards. They include mind-reading prophecy, mind reading and prophecy, materialization and dematerialization, the ability to interfere with the mechanisms of motor cars and clocks, to mention but a few. Such alleged abilities, particularly with the psychophysical ones that suggest an advanced technology, would argue in favor of possibility number 5, if they could be both consistently demonstrated and proved to be effects with no conceivable natural causes. But the 9, according to Tom, are disinclined to produce signs and wonders to order, for they have tried such tactics in the past and have only been deified for their trouble, which annoys them, because it is man's cooperation and not his worship that they need in order to accomplish their purpose. This is a coherent attitude. Tom exhibits a robust intelligence and consistency of purpose and attitude that is suggestive, if not evidential, of his independent existence. As William James remarked, most mediumistic trance utterances have a generic similarity in different individuals, and consists of a curiously vague, optimistic philosophy and water, and could have been written by the same author. Sinning group communications do not fall into this category. Whoever or whatever Tom is, he is impressively original. But, of course, so are the people he is involved with. The question is he original in a different way? One way of approaching this question is to consider how he interrelates with the others. Patterns of relationships is the next heading. Both as teacher and as a colleague in an undertaking, Tom consistently exhibits superior wisdom, knowledge and psychological insight. He understands the problems of the 3, which they have with their own personalities and in their relations with each other, and particularly the problems they have encountered through their involvement with and dedication to the work. He has repeatedly warned them, collectively and individually, of the dangers of excessive zeal. When reporting the communications, I've had to be very selective, for in the period covered by this book, there were more than 100 hours of taped material. From that, I have selected some passages to bring in at this point as examples of psychological and moral statement that suggest Tom's independence of mind. Early in the work, Phyllis had marital and family problems as a result of her commitment, and in one communication that she channeled, Tom made a strong statement apropos this state of affairs. The being, this is Phyllis Schlemmer, the being is confused. There is within her the essence of truth, but remember, there is also the strong desire to be involved with you. It is true that she is dedicated to what she believes is her dedication, but you do not remove yourself from what you are responsible for without doing it in a manner that does not cause a friction or great hurt to someone else, because you also are responsible for the soul of that person. She cannot run from what she must settle first, before she can be free. John, too, has on several occasions been admonished for his excessive zeal, which tends to take the form of an intense and unremitting application to the work. Tom told him, "We ask you to relax. It does not help your work for you to be intense. It is important that you have some form of what you call relaxation or diversion, such as to turn onto your television or listen to music or to read or to walk or to visit with gentle friends on a different subject. It is important in your physical world to maintain a balance, and you cannot maintain a balance if there is not a diversion. You must relax in order to function at a higher level." This is a pertinent advice which shows a shrewd insight into John's character. This is Sir John Whitmore, the racing driver. Unfortunately, he's dead. In another communication, Tom probed deeper and said, "His weakness is a triple weakness. It is a weakness of guilt, and the guilt that creates another problem with Sir John, for he tries to remove his guilt by doing, and then he begins to build a resentment and a feeling of pity for himself. Sir John, what we are trying to say to you is that you strive so hard for balance that you are always unbalanced, and in that situation those that you love and are the ones that are hurt by you. And when you are in that situation of trying so hard to be balanced, it is when you are easily led astray. You are a paradox, Sir John. At times you are overly generous, and then the goodness that you have done, on the other hand, you wipe out on the other. At times you are overly generous, and then the goodness that you have done, on the one hand, you then wipe out on the other. It is your constant attempting to balance. But if you will not try to balance, all of a sudden, you will be balanced. Andrija too has received psychoanalysis and pertinent advice about his personal problems from Tom, and I only need to refer the reader to his quarrels with Tom over Phyllis when they were in Ankara, and on the subject of coherence at Ossining in February, to establish the point that by functioning in relation to the three as a teacher and counsellor, one might even say as a guru figure, and by exhibiting subtle psychological insight, acumen and wisdom in his role, Tom affords us strong evidence of his independent existence. It would be naive, however, to claim that it is conclusive evidence. In some recorded cases of dual or multiple personality, a secondary personality has shown remarkable insight into the psychology of the primary personality. In the recent and in immense complex case of Sybil Dorset, for example, one of Sybil's 16 other self was so knowledgeable about the other personalities inhabiting Sybil's body that she was able to help the psychiatrist, Dr. Wilbur, integrate them all into the new Sybil. I know of no case, though, in which a secondary personality has shown wisdom and insight comparable to Tom's in respect of other people, or made so many statements of wide general relevance, exhibiting a profound understanding of human life and character and a consistent moral viewpoint. Let us pass from Tom as teacher to Tom as colleague. There are many passages in the communications that sound for all the world like company board meetings with Tom officiating as chairman. To pursue the analogy, it is as if the company were a holding company, Universe Unlimited, and the meetings concerned primarily, but not exclusively, with the present problems of its subsidiary, Planet Earth. The chairman has long experience of the problems of the subsidiary, which has not only consistently failed to contribute to the growth of the company as a whole, but now is in such a sorry plight that it threatens to cause the company to stagnate or even to have to go into liquidation. On several occasions in the past, the management has invested fresh capital in attempts to raise the level of the subsidiary's productivity, and the chairman can tell you all about these occasions, who was involved in them, what they accomplished at the time and why they ultimately failed. He knows it all. He was there and he remembers, but he suffers from one of the drawbacks of top management: inadequate expertise in dealing with conditions at shop floor level. And he is bound by the policy of the company not to intervene in the anatomy of subsidiaries, which is why he needs understanding and active colleagues on planet Earth. John feels strongly that the Nine have frequently demonstrated an uncanny understanding of the shop floor level, in spite of their claims to the contrary, claims which, he believes, have been made merely to let us off the hook at times, when we were not able to handle what they were telling us about our own weaknesses. As an example of the board meeting type of session, I would refer the reader to the discussion of the need for a statement of purpose and program, page 134 and 136. Here, as in many of the communications, we witness a vigorous and intelligent exchange of the views and attitudes of independent minds. There is a genuine give and take. A problem is posed, different feelings and opinions with regard to it are aired, and an understanding is reached through the introduction of a point of view, not previously entertained. A point of view, moreover, that is recognizably consistent with Tom's general philosophy and ostensible situation. Authentic dialogue and dialectic are frequently to be found in the communications, and it is then it's this fact, rather than their information content, that poses the biggest challenge to the parapsychological hypothesis. Mental contents are one thing, and mental functions quite another. And when we encounter the latter exercised with versatility, spontaneity, and generic consistency, it is difficult to resist the conviction that we are in the presence of an independent mind. So I think we may say, by way of summary, that in relation to Andrija, John, and Phyllis, Tom manifests a superior wisdom and psychological insight in the role of teacher, and an originality and dialectical vigor in the role of colleague, that are not difficult to reconcile with the view that he is a product of one or more of their own minds. Other heading: Other mental functions and attributes. As I have listened to the recordings of the communications in sequence over the past months, I have been struck by three particular characteristics. Tom's faculty for total and accurate recall of the content of earlier communications, the factual and conceptual consistency of communications as a whole, and a curious decline in the language of the communications with the passage of time. These 3 points may be illustrated with one example. The reader will recall that the very first time Tom appeared was when Phyllis fell into an involuntary trance at Count Pino Turola's house in Miami and uttered a chant in an ancient language. Tom explained that the language came from some 34,000 years ago, when there were 3 cultures, 3 divisions from 3 areas of the universe. One came with love, one came to own, and one came to observe. The one that observed recorded it. The one that possessed controlled the minds. What? The one that observed recorded it. The one that possessed controlled the minds. The being that came tried to prevent. There was a massacre. A much more advanced civilization began, then was lost. That was in March 1974. 6 months later, in 1974, October, Andrija referred back to this communication, and without prompting, Tom said, "We spoke at that time of a massacre." Another year passed, and in October 1975, John again referred to the first communication and asked how it related to what they had learned since. Tom answered, "If you will review those of your communications, it is of a similar type. There were of those that began of that of the earth, and that of the seeding of the earth, and that of the doctor came in that of the time, and that of the doctor came in that of the time. And there were of those of the negative forces that came to attempt to control. If you can recall, we have told you of that too. And there were those, such as that of Altea, and of other higher civilizations, that had of the observation and remembrance of this. And there was of you, and of you of our doctor, that in truth observed, and that of us." Then Tom asked about the massacre and received the reply, "It was a diminishing of spiritual self." This communication, of much later vintage than others in this book, and the decline in the language, will be apparent to every reader. Asked to explain this, Tom has said that it is due to a gradual exhaustion of the channeling faculties of the being, and in view of our ignorance and of the mechanism referred to, we either have to accept this or put it down to a refinement of cunning on Phyllis's part. If it were the latter, it would be a rather supererogatory refinement, and one that would be tedious to sustain. The chief interest of the above-quoted passage, however, is that it elaborates a communication that antedates it by 18 months with information received in the interim. With references to the seeding, the previous incarnation of Andrija and John, the civilizations of Altea, and the attempt of the negative forces to exercise control, both elucidate the original message and are elucidated by this. This is but one example. Statements like, "If you review your tapes," and "if you recall," occur occur constantly in the communications, and subsequent checking has always confirmed that the point referred to has indeed been previously communicated. Tom's faculty of total and instantaneous recall is certainly impressive. Even more impressive is the consistency of the factual and conceptual content of the communications. There's nothing ad hoc about the information, no sense of it having been built up as the communications have proceeded. It carries the stamp of something revealed rather than created, of something that existed in toto before the first communication was received. Tom's initial elliptical reference to the three cultures, of which one came with love, one came to own, and one came to observe, encapsulated a mass of detailed information that was to be elaborated in later communications. It is information one feels that was already there, and to say already there implies the existence of an independent mind, unless we wish to invoke the ancient esoteric belief in the Akashic records, which is a point I shall return to later. If neither of the hypotheses I have categorized as transcendental were correct, we would expect Tom to exhibit ESP abilities. The term, of course, means extrasensory perception, and as neither a discarnate entity nor an extraterrestrial would have a sensory system like that of a human being, he would not be subject to the limitations of human sensory systems. Tom does, in fact, convincingly exhibit faculties of telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Often in the communications he says, "Yes, Sir John," or "Yes, Doctor," and invariably John or Andrija responds immediately with a question or by making a point that clearly was on his mind, and he was waiting to put it out. They became accustomed to this, and it soon ceased to surprise them, and the listener to the tapes too tend to become blasé about small marvels when the frontiers of big credulity are under barrage from much bigger guns. But the evidence for Tom's infallibility, right anticipatory telepathy and mind reading is convincing and has to be taken into account in an attempt to determine who or what Tom is. Evidence for precognition is also convincing, particularly with regard to developments in the Middle East political situation, as I pointed out in the final chapter of the narrative. As regards clairvoyance, Tom has often allegedly exercised this faculty in order to report to his colleagues on the deliberation taking place in the higher political echelons in the US, Russia, Israel, and the Arab countries. But of course, the truth of these reports is difficult to verify, though occasionally one can pick up an intriguing hint of a correspondence. For example, within days of the completion of their last mission in Israel, the Jerusalem Post reported the visit of a top Russian missile expert to Syria. Also, the allegations that the US was considering military action in Saudi Arabia seemed too fantastic when Tom made it in November 1974. But in January, Dr. Kissinger made a faux pas by stating publicly that the use of force against the oil-producing countries would be dangerous, but could not be ruled out. And during his Middle East trip in March 1975, he had to make a special visit to the Saudi Arabian capital to explain himself to King Faisal. To conclude this section then, the evidence for the exercise of supernormal, by human standards, memory functions and of what we would call ESP faculties, together with the inherent consistency of the communications, supports the same conclusion it was arrived at in the two previous subsections of this discussion, that Tom is an independent intelligence of some kind. In other words, it weighs in favor of our original hypothesis, number 4 and 5. Let us now approach the question of Tom's identity from another angle and consider. Heading: the content of the communications. In recent years, a great deal has been published on the subjects of UFOs, prehistoric civilizations on Earth, the visits and influence of extraterrestrials, Atlantis, reincarnation, the intelligence of apocalypse. There are also the predominant themes of the communications. Depending on your point of view, you might argue that this correspondence indicates that objective truth is now being revealed to different individuals and groups on Earth, or that it is a case of the exponential growth of a congeries of baseless beliefs powered by a man's incorrigible need for novelties and wonders. William James observed that the zeitgeist has always much to do with shaping trance phenomena, and he raised the question whether all subconscious selves are peculiarly susceptible to a certain stratum of the zeitgeist and get their information from it. This is a question we should certainly bear in mind when considering the significance of the fact that the contents of the communications corresponds with that of a great deal of contemporary popular esotericisms. But to speak of getting information from a stratum of the zeitgeist is rather vague. It is not a description of how the information is obtained, but an observation that it corresponds with information from other sources. It is an insight worth pursuing, though, to let us consider the possibilities as to how and when the information content of the communications is obtained. Again, I suggest 5 possibilities for consideration. First, that the information is stored in Phyllis's unconscious memory and becomes accessible only when she's in a trance. 2, that in trance Phyllis establishes a rapport with the unconscious minds of the sitters and draws the information therefrom. 3, that she draws the information from the consciousness of a distant person or persons, or by clairvoyance from books, etc. 4, that she has access to the cosmic reservoir of information and memories that esoterics call the Akashic records. 5, that she is indeed channeling information that emanates from a non-human intelligence. I will make a few remarks on each of these possibilities. With regard to the first, in the critical literature of physical research, the possession of unlikely knowledge is often put down to cryptomnesia, or unconscious memory. If the person has at any time had access to the information in question, even by glancing through a book many years before, it is theoretically possible that a photographic memory function of the unconscious may be triggered into action when the person is in an altered state of consciousness, such as a trance. However, Phyllis is not a bookish person, nor widely read, and considering the wide range of subject matters covered by the communications, and also the fact that there is an internal consistency between information in different categories, for instance cosmology and the interpretation of revelations, cryptomnesia seems a highly improbable explanation. It is also, incidentally, one that Tom is well aware of. In one communication he said, "If one of your channels were a student of the book, which is the Bible, and then in her channeling or in her dream state or her inspirational state, she received information as in the book, would you know if it were true or in her mind? It is better for the channel not to have previous knowledge." The possibility that Phyllis relays back information which she draws from the minds of the sitters is, on the face of it, more plausible. Andrija particularly is knowledgeable and a widely read man. There are problems with this explanation, however. For one thing, the range and quality of the content of communication does not vary with the identity of the sitters. Andrija was not present, for instance, when Tom elaborated his statement about the beginnings of civilization on Earth, and in the period subsequent to the one covered by the present narrative. There have been many sessions in which he has not participated, and some from which John has been absent, but the content of these communications is totally consistent with the rest. Telepathy is said to work regardless of distance, so it may be argued that Phyllis is still drawing on Andrija's unconscious even when he's not present, but the parapsychological studies that have demonstrated telepathy at a distance have also shown that information thus obtained tends to be fragmentary, discontinuous, imagistic, rather than conceptual. There is no evidence that coherent and sustained thought can be conveyed or picked up telepathically. The same applies to the hypothesis of selective clairvoyance. As much of the information is elicited by questioning and not simply given, and as it builds up into a consistent pattern, piece by piece, over a period of time, in order to support the clairvoyance hypothesis, we would have to assume the workings of a consistent principle of selectivity, and that a multiplicity of channels to different kinds of information would be simultaneously open. This is what Professor Hornell Hart, discussing the survival question, called the super-ESP hypothesis. The acquisition of virtually any information can be attributed to super-ESP, and if the communications consisted only of information, the hypothesis might apply. But, as we have seen, they consist of much more, and the teachings, the exhortations, the pertinent psychoanalysis, the spontaneous wisdom, the personal criticism, and the vigorous dialectic are all in favor that argue against the super-ESP hypothesis. So again, logical consideration weigh in favor of possibilities 4 and 5. As for the Akashic record explanation, the idea that there exists a cosmic reservoir of information and memories that can be tapped by a gifted psychic, there would seem to be little to choose from the point of view of plausibility between this and the non-human intelligence hypothesis. It is perhaps relevant to note that Edgar Cayce material, which has some characteristics in common with the Ossining communications, was said to have been derived from a kind of cosmic reservoir of knowledge, and that in later communications Tom has said that such does in fact exist. The method of argument by elimination, which I have followed in the foregoing pages, can only, of course, favor one of several predetermined conclusions, and so it is always open to the criticism that there may be other hypotheses that have not been taken into account. I cannot think of any, however, and I would submit the conclusion that the evidence we have surveyed is compatible with our hypothesis number 5, that Phyllis is channeling information that emanates from a non-human intelligence, whereas it is not compatible with the more obvious psychological and parapsychological explanations. But the term non-human intelligence could apply to either of our original hypotheses 4 and 5, a discarnate spirit or an intelligent being from another part of the cosmos. Can we now determine which of these alternatives the facts favor? I believe we can consider a few points that are germane to the question, though I'm well aware that some readers with a psychological turn of mind will consider that no attempt rationally to choose between two hypotheses when there is no empirical basis for belief in either of them is an absurd enterprise. For the sake of the argument, we have to assume that both spirits and extraterrestrials might exist. The reader might recall the conclusion reached by the Columbia Professor of Logic and Ethics, James Hislop, that in a number of cases, persons whose conditions would ordinarily be described as due to some form of mental disturbance shows unmistakably indications of invasion by foreign or discarnate agency. The formulation foreign or discarnate entities corresponds with our hypothesis 4 and 5. So, assuming that they both exist, how would you distinguish a spirit from an extraterrestrial? Well, for a start, the content of their respective communications might be a pointer. There is quite a substantial literature of alleged spirit communications, but they tend to fall into William James' philosophy and water category, as that most critical of early physical researchers, Frank Whitmore, wrote of the Reverend Stainton Moses' spirit teachings, it needed not that a spirit should descend from the seventh sphere to preach views which could be heard from any Unitarian pulpit. Such teachings, which are usually obtained through automatic writing, generally consist of pious sentiments, exhortations to a more noble way of life, and descriptions of the next world, all couched in a pedestrian and woolly language, makes the sarcasm of the term inspirational writings, which is often applied to them. Podmore's remarks about spirit teaching implies, particularly for the modern reader, that Stainton Moses' automatic writing was channeling nothing more than contents of his own subconscious. But this is not a justified conclusion on the evidence of the content alone. Oh, well, I make 2 parts of this. The end of the end, tomorrow.